Thomas Hussey, E&A. Having just watched a footballing performance, I would like you to highlight the performer's strengths and weaknesses in skills, fitness and tactics to prioritise a major weakness and give an action plan for this weakness that includes a timescale, coaching points and progressive practices. You should support your evaluative comments and your action plan by applying relevant theory from the physiological, psychological and socio-cultural areas you have studied.
Okay, before I start off with my skill section, strength and weaknesses, I'd like to say that the performance that I've just watched would be in the performance level of the pyramid. The reason I can tell this is because you can tell that he's been doing regular training. The game also had a slight level of competition or a competitive nature to it, which also shows me this is at the performance level. Also, I'd like to say that he's at the associative level of learning. I can tell this because you can clearly tell that he's able to use different environmental factors to change the way in which he uses his skills. So that's the reason that he's in the associative stage of learning. Firstly, I saw his passing was a weakness. The reason it was a weakness was because he was passing it into areas of the pitches or to players in areas of the pitches where there was a lot of pressure. This meant that his team had a higher chance of losing the ball and therefore giving the possession away to the opposition. This would be using strength endurance, as passing is a skill that's repeated multiple times throughout the game, and the definition of strength endurance is actually repeated muscular contractions. So passing would be using strength endurance throughout the game. Second skill would be heading. This was a strength. Not only was he able to actually win the headers that he went up for, he was able to win them, but then if the opportunity came about, he would be able to head the ball actually to one of his teammates, which meant that his team would retain possession and hopefully build an attack which could have been successful. The next skill that I noticed was tackling. This was also a strength. So again, a bit like heading, he was able to win the ball most of the time, but not only be able to win it, he was also able to retain possession and keep the ball in his feet, which then meant he could pass it off to an opponent. Pass it off to a teammate, which meant that he would then retain possession and his team could move forward and make an attack. After this, I noticed jockeying as well, which was also a strength. What he was able to do was shape his body in a way that would force his opponents wide or away from the dangerous areas of the pitches. And the reason this is important is because if the ball or he can force an opponent out of the dangerous areas of the pitches, this reduces the chance of his team conceding to an opposition's successful attack. The next skill was receiving. This was a weakness. Multiple times his actual control of the ball wasn't able to keep the ball close enough to his body, so therefore he lost the ball to opponents, and because obviously he's a defensive player, the areas where he's operating or the areas where he was losing the ball because of his receiving was quite dangerous, which meant that the other team had a successful chance to attack and increase the chances of his team conceding. This skill is fine on the skill continuum. The reason is because it uses smaller muscle groups than a gross skill, and it's not concentrating on force or power. It's more concentrating on actual accuracy and controlling the ball with intricacy, which is opposite to gross, where we're more concentrating on force and power. The last skill that I noticed was shooting. This was a strength. Although he didn't have actually many shots, the shots that he did have were all on target. And the reason this is so important for his team was because having shots on target forced saves from the goalkeeper, which then meant that his team had a chance to actually get the rebound, which could have created a scoring opportunity, which if he actually didn't get it on target, the ball would have gone out for a goal kick, and all the pressure that his team had just built would have been lost. So his shooting was a major strength for him. Shooting would actually use explosive strength. So this is the ability to expend maximal energy in one or a series of movements, which shooting is one long movement. And also it's an explosive strength because it would use the ATP-PC system, because it's a very short, it's only a very short time period that the shooting action takes place in. Onto the fitness section. The first fitness component that I noticed was cardiovascular endurance. Now, this was quite a bad weakness because when he was supporting his winger, when he was going forward with his team, towards the end of the game, he wasn't able to actually get back from making these attacks. So this was quite crucial for his team, because this leaves quite big holes in the defence, and increases the chances of the other team making a successful counter-attack after his team loses possession. Now I'd suggest the reason behind this is because his cardiovascular system would be very weak. This would mean that at high intensities he wouldn't be able to resynthesize enough ATP, so therefore his body then relies on the lactic acid system while running back, and obviously a byproduct of the lactic acid system is lactic acid, and this can create fatigue in the legs, which I suggest this is why he wouldn't be able to track back as quick as he got forward, which then created problems for his team. On to muscular endurance, which was also a weakness. Towards the end you could tell that he wasn't able to actually clear the ball as far as he previously did. Now this is quite crucial for his team, as if his team is under a lot of pressure and he's responsible for clearing the ball but he can't clear it as far, the pressure isn't relieved off his team, the opposition can mount another successful attack and increase the chances of his team conceding. Now this particular muscular endurance would be using strength endurance, so this is the ability to repeat muscular contractions. I would suggest that he had a poor strength endurance because obviously he wouldn't be able to clear as far towards the end of the game. And we could test this by doing a sit-up test, which is how many sit-ups can be done in a minute or 30 seconds. And with the results of his muscular endurance being weak, I would suggest that he would also have a poor score on the sit-up test. On to the third fitness, is suppleness. This was a strength. We mainly saw this in his tackling, where he was able to stretch his legs quite far in order to reach the ball for tackles. Now this meant that more of his tackles were successful, and therefore he gave away less fouls because he was able to reach the ball every time, which would take pressure off his team. Obviously if he's not giving away fouls, then the opposition can't mount an attack off free kicks. The next fitness component was agility. This was a strength, so this sort of links back to jockeying, which was in my skill section, and he was able to change direction very quickly, which meant that the player that he was marking wasn't able to get much space away from him. Therefore it reduces the influence that this player has on the game, and therefore if the other team is attacking and he's able to reduce the influence that this player has, it reduces the chances of the attack being successful. After this I noticed coordination, which was a weakness. There was an occasion where he actually missed the ball, which meant that the ball was easily the ball was easily taken up by the opposition, and because of him being a defensive player, these were in dangerous areas of the pitches and increased the chance of his team conceding. And finally, for fitness, I noticed speed, which was a strength. Sort of again links back to jockeying. How he was able to keep the player wide, but not only was he able to keep them wide, he was able to chase them when they went wide, to keep up with them down the wing, which meant that he was able to more successfully block crosses or block any passes made by the player that he was chasing, which obviously keeps the ball out of the dangerous areas of the pitches for his team and reduces the chance of conceding. When using speed or sprinting, I would suggest that he had a large percentage of fast glycosidic muscle fibres. The reason I can tell this is because these fibres have a higher speed of contraction and a higher force of contraction, meaning that you can actually run quicker than maybe other people on the pitch. But linking back to muscular endurance, these fast glycosidic muscle fibres also fatigue a lot quicker than slow muscle fibres, slow twitch. So this could be why his muscular endurance was quite poor. Onto the tactics section. The first tactic was keeping possession. This was a weakness. So this links back to passing, where his passing was quite poor, because he was passing into dangerous areas of the pitches where his team would often lose the ball because of his pass, and therefore increase the chance of him conceding due to the opposition gaining possession in dangerous areas of the pitch. The second tactic was man marking. This also linked back to agility, where his player that he was marking wasn't able to get much space away from him, meaning he reduced the influence of that player in the game and reduced the chance of him team conceding. On to the third tactic, which was vision. So I'll split this into on-the-ball vision and off-the-ball vision. Both were a weakness. On the ball, he was often looking for passes which were quite long range. These long range passes, would rarely come off. But if they would come off, that would be a high success. Would lead to high success. For example, it would have been a key pass to send a player through on goal. So this shows that he was a high knack performer, which means he had a high need to achieve. So this is because he strives for success more. So his need to achieve is higher than his fear of failure, meaning that he's more likely to go for the passes that very rarely come off, but would lead to large amounts of success, for example a goal, and that's why he's a high knack performer. Also, the off-the-ball section would be also a weakness. So I mostly noticed this when he was tracking back, he was marking a player and he was looking over his shoulder. He wasn't able to tell or imagine where the pass was going to be made into the path of the player that he was marking. Therefore, he wasn't able to move in a position into which he could intercept the pass. So this increased the chance of the counter-attack of the opponents being successful, as he wasn't able to move into a position to intercept. And finally, for tactics, the tactic was keeping the player wide. So by keeping the this was a strength, sorry. By keeping the player wide, you keep him at the dangerous areas of the pitches, meaning that it reduces the chance of his team conceding. So this sort of links back to speed and jockeying, where he was able to keep up with the player, keep them wide and block the crosses. A priority weakness that I'd like to now talk about and improve is passing. So I'd start off, my test for passing would be 20 passes successfully through a gate to an opponent, and I would time this at the start and then retest at the end of a training session. And also I would like to see the success rate of his passing in a game increase. So this uses the principle of training of testing, which then would in turn allow me to see whether the overload of my training is hard enough for the performer. If he's not reaching these goals, I'd suggest that I would have to increase the overload. So I could do this by increasing the frequency, so how many times we train a week or a month. The intensity, so I could reduce the rest periods between drills in a training session. I could change the type of training that I'm doing, and I could also change the time, so increase the length of time that he's training for during each training session. And the timescale for this would be 1 month, 3 times a week for 40 minutes. Now the reason it's quite a short timescale is because of the fact that we're trying to learn a skill rather than a component of fitness. So learning a skill actually takes a lot shorter, or to improve a skill, sorry, takes a shorter time period than it would do to improve a component of fitness. So that's why it's only a month long and quite a short time scale. So before we just go on to the coaching points, I'd like to say that the actual skill of passing is an open skill and quite externally paced, which are both linked. This is because the pass, or when the pass is done, or where the pass is aimed at, is all dependent on external factors. So this could be because of where a teammate is, where the opponent is, where you are on the pitch. Loads of different factors come into play, and that's the reason it's an open skill and externally paced. Also, it's in between, or can be either gross or fine on the skill continuum, depending on the distance. So it can be gross if it's a long distance pass, where we're more focused on using large muscle groups to put force behind the ball to make sure it reaches the target. Whereas it can also be fine because if it's a short distance pass, which is what we'll mainly be focusing on, where we're using smaller muscle groups, slightly less force, and we're more bothered about the accuracy in short range passes. So that's the reason it's fine. So I've broken it down into preparation, execution and recovery phases of the model skill. So at the start of the preparation phase, we'd have the foot planted, so this would be the weak foot that's not going to be striking the ball, next to the ball, facing the direction we would like it to go. So this would be plantar flexion of the ankle, using the gastrocnemius as the agonist and the tibialis anterior as the antagonist, which will be relaxed. It will also be using the hinge joint of the knee as well. Secondly, as part of the preparation phase, the upper body will have to be leaned over the ball to make sure the ball remains on the floor when passed. This will be done by the pelvic girdle rotating forward, which will bring the upper body over the ball. Thirdly, the knees will be slightly bent, especially the one that's planted on the floor, because we don't want it too straight, because that would be more focused on power, like a shot. So we'll have it slightly bent, and this will be an isometric contraction, as the knee will be staying in the same position and the muscles will be remaining the same length. So this would be an isometric contraction of the semimembranosus and the rectus femoris of the quadriceps and the semitendinosus of the hamstring. Finally, in the preparation phase, the striking leg will be pulled back so the heel is close to touching the gluteal. This would be flexion of the gluteal, and it will also be an isotonic concentric contraction. So isotonic because the actual length of the muscle is changing, and concentric because it's actually getting smaller or tightening. Now onto the execution phase. The foot, or the striking foot, will come down and hit the ball using the side of the foot. Now the reason we're using the side of the foot is because we are more bothered about accuracy rather than power. So the actual laces of the foot would be more likely used for something like a shot, which in this case we're not bothered about the power. The foot coming down and striking the ball would be using Newton's law of acceleration, which is the rate in the change of direction of an object is proportional to the force applied. So in this case the ball would be the object and the force applied would be the power in which, or the speed in which, the foot actually makes contact with the ball. And this is quite important as we're doing short range passes. We need it to be weighted correctly, so the foot will have to hit the ball in proportion to how far we actually want to kick the ball. It also uses law of inertia, as many times that the pass will be made, or most of the time, the ball will be still, and it will remain in this constant state until a force is activated, which will be the kicking motion of the pass. The final bit of theory for this is that it will be using the rotation of the ball and socket joint of the hip. We need a good contact of the ball to make sure that we reduce injury, because the ball and socket joint is actually the most unstable. So we need a good contact with the ball, because for example, if we kick the floor or anything, we do risk injury during this process. Finally, onto the recovery. We start off with the striking foot following through and planting on the floor in order to stop our momentum. After this, we would have to be straight on our toes using plantar flexion, making sure we're ready to anticipate the next moves with also slightly bent knees. Now the reason we want to do this is so we can move quicker to the next movement, so this reduces response time. So response time is made up of reaction time and movement time. So by being on our toes, we can reduce the movement time to the next play in the game, and therefore our response time is reduced, which means that we will actually be able to increase our performance, for example, by getting to the ball quicker than an opponent. Now on to progressive practices. So before I start, I'd like to say that I'd use, throughout this progressive practice, I'd like to use verbal and visual guidance, a mixture. So verbal is usually used for elite athletes and autonomous learners, and visual is usually used for cognitive, so they can make an imagery of the skill that they're about to do. So I'd use a mixture as we're in the associative stage of learning. So I'll start off quite simple with 2 cones 10 yards apart, with a player on each cone, one of them being the individual that I'm actually training. And I'll ask them to just make 20 successful passes, nicely weighted and accurate, before we move on to the next step. So the reason I've started off with limited factors involved is to allow or establish kinesthesis of the skill. So it means that the actual performer is not actually thinking about anything else apart from just how the skill feels and whether or not he's doing the technique correctly, rather than concentrating on any other factors. After this, I'd add a small cone gate 1 metre apart, and it'd be the same as the first drill. I'd just ask them to pass between each other, but making sure the pass travels through the gate. Now I'd ask them to complete 35 of these successfully with a nice weight and accuracy before we move on to the next step. And the reason I've actually increased it slightly from 20 successful passes to move on to 35 in this step is so that it increases his motivation, as he's got something to aim for to move on. And I've also used goal setting, or the realistic section of goal setting, in order to make sure that it's not too difficult, so he remains motivated but it's not too difficult that he actually becomes unmotivated and believes that he won't achieve it. The next stage would be keep the previous step exactly the same, but every successful pass I would ask him to step in 1 yard or 1 step until you reach the middle, where every successful pass after that you would step out until you reach the cones again. So the reason I would do this is to help increase the stimulus and response bond between the actual distance of the player that's needed to pass to and the weight of the pass. So the stimulus would be the distance and the response would be the weight. So by changing the distance constantly, it will help build the stimulus and response bond by between how hard we need to weight the pass and the distance we are away from our player. So for example, like in a game, we come across many distance passes that we need to make. So hopefully when we do put him in a game situation, he'll have the stimulus and response already there to know how hard he'll need to kick the ball in the game. The next step after this would do the same as the previous step, stepping in and out, but instead of stepping in and out, we do stepping sideways, where we pass the ball slightly in front of our opponent so he can move on to it until we've done that 10 times and then move back to the original position. Step after this, I would go to the previous step, so we would now stay in the same position but we'd add a pole acting as a defender. So we would receive one side of the pole, take the ball round the pole and pass the other side, maybe using the other foot. And the final part of the progressive practice before we moved into the game would be I would have 2 channels, 5 yards across each, and that'd be 10 yards long, with 10 yards, and both channels would be 10 yards apart. So the individual that I'm training would be in one, and his teammate that he's been training with would be in the other channel. And the aim of the game would be pass the ball successfully across the channel. But between channels, sorry. But the only thing stopping them would be 2 opponents that I would put in between the channel in the 10-yard gap. And as part of social facilitation, I would make sure that these opponents would be slightly superior ability to the person that I'm training. This is in order to increase the motivation of the learner, as it'll make him want to achieve their skill level, and also helps the skill become habitual as he wants to prove himself to opponents that are slightly superior. Onto the condition game, I would make a 15 metre by 15 metre grid with 2 coned areas, which would be a metre wide at each side. And to score, you would have to make a successful pass to a teammate that stood inside that 1 metre coned area at each side. And finally, to finish off, I'd like to say that this is a progressive part practice. So this means that we start off with very limited factors and slowly progress and add more until we reach a condition game. And throughout, I would make sure that I'm giving him positive reinforcement. So this helps increase his motivation to begin to carry on training. It helps the learning of the skill, as the positive reinforcement would only be given when he does the skill correctly. And also, it would help increase his attitude towards training in the future by using positive reinforcement. That's it.